All right, everybody. We are back this week. I was all enthusiastic about finishing up. I'm like, I'll do another stream later. And then let's stick with Monday. This is the day to get this done. So I am returning to reviewing the same video from last week and finishing it up. I think we got not quite halfway through, although I think a lot of the meat of what I was going to raise objections to occurred in that first part. Yeah, we can get started in a minute, but let's just see what people are saying in the chat. Give me one moment just to check a couple things. And 1 second. Alrighty. Okay, got a couple settings out of the way. And the other thing we're going to need to do is a sound check. So I will share the screen. And I'm just getting this set up. All right, should be good to go. Let's do the whole screen. All right, so I hope there's enough people that you could let me know whether the sound is balanced with my audio. Let me move my mic a little bit. I gotta get one of those mic stands where it's like right up in your face, but I guess you don't really need that for what I'm doing here. All right, so let me know how the sound is on this.
This is Rachel's point. And once again, I think this shows what's so deeply unsatisfactory about cultural relativism. So it seems like moral realism would be the right answer, right? Well, not so fast.
Okay, so this is about where we were. If anyone is available in the chat, just let me know if it sounds good. I wish there was a better way for me to do this so I don't take up stream time doing this, but I see a lot of people spend time in streams just super chill. So I gotta learn to chill. Like people will study or really have long pauses. I've never been comfortable with long conversational pauses. I want to fill the silence. Okay, that's 2 people. I did say I want 3, but we don't have a lot of people on the stream right now, so that's already probably enough. So why don't I just get started? Waste time. And I am also, after a couple people talk to me, I'm thinking of great. So that's 3. So we're good to go. I'm thinking of because I use StreamYard for this. I may have to switch to something else. Oh, and I didn't start using all my backgrounds yet. See, I even have the nihilism background. So we'll use that. I basically just ask Midjourney to make some like edgy nihilistic scenic imagery, and it came through. I think. So right. So I may swap out of using StreamYard and start using something that's a little more reliable. I'm continuing to get that loop thing. I don't know how to fix that. I know a couple of people have said, oh, it's really easy. And then they go on to explain incredibly complicated stuff, kind of like people that are always like, oh, you could fix stuff in your own car. No, I can't. So if I got weird software stuff, I'd have to have someone walk me through it step by step to get it fixed. If someone wants to do that and I could get StreamYard working, I'd be happy to do that. But, and the last time I streamed, we had a, irresolvable error, like a problem. We didn't know how to fix it and we had to give up. So not happy with how StreamYard's been working for me. But let's see. Yes. Okay. So let's just get started. And I also should say, I usually watch a whole video first, but I think I got about 2/3 of the way through this. So there might be some stuff I haven't seen. So you might see a sort of a first pass reaction. Last week, I had already seen all that. And I still got fired up about it. So let's see where we go with this today.
The main problem with moral realism is that it's just tough to justify. And as we're going to see, it actually ends up contradicting atheism and naturalism more generally. The first is just there have been a ton of books arguing that we can explain our moral intuitions without needing any of them to be true. And thus, under naturalism, at least by Occam's razor, many say we should just discard them completely. I mean, think about it. What moral realism is proposing is what I would argue are 2 very controversial claims. One is the ontology of moral facts. Like there are these magical things that just exist out there that are somehow true or not. But the second is actually the epistemic piece, which may be even more difficult to justify. How is it possible that we come to know these facts?
So this is a good distinction. So you have 2 major sort of argumentative hurdles that moral realists are going to need to cross. One of them is the metaphysical one. And that's, the hurdle of accounting for the ontology of the moral facts themselves. Like, what is their nature? How could there be a thing like that? So on and so forth. And there's various proposed solutions or efforts, and different sorts of positions will take different approaches to resolving the matter. Naturalists will try to, treat the moral facts as natural facts. Non-naturalists face, in some ways, steeper challenges, because whenever you're sort of departing from naturalism and you're endorsing these sort of non-naturalist views, you could run into some potential issues. On the other hand, non-naturalism doesn't always face the struggles of accounting for some of the qualities people may want out of the realist account. And you do have attempts that sort of try to circumvent all of this, where they try to minimize or deflate the amount of metaphysics you need for a robust type of realism. And you have views like Parfit that will try to sort of extract the metaphysics out of it and say, I'm making a conceptual claim here. It doesn't really have the heavy duty metaphysics. But on the other hand, you have this other issue, which is, let's say there were moral facts of whatever kind, like conditional on some metaphysical account of what their nature is. How would you know what they were? And these two approaches, the epistemic and the metaphysical approaches, aren't in total isolation of one another. But there is that issue of, whatever. Let's just say that there are these moral facts. How would you know about them? And I do think that is Spencer Case's biggest worry in the most recent book that I've read on meta-ethics, Is Morality Real? And that's Spencer Case, a moral realist, and Matt Lutz, a moral anti-realist. And in that book, I believe, if I recall, I just read this part where Case is addressing this, and I already am not 100% sure if I recall exactly. I'm gonna have to read it a second time. But I think Case says that skepticism is the big story, that basically the epistemic issue is a bigger worry than the metaphysical issue. That may be true.
These things need to be accounted for or supported for moral realism to be true. So let me give you an analogy. Consider vision. For me to be able to make factual statements about things like trees, first of all, trees must exist, but there must be more than trees for me to be able to have anything like a knowledge about trees. We also need some sort of visual system we can trust that gives us accurate visual information that counts as knowledge. If we can't trust our visual system, we have no way of knowing anything about the external world from this particular sense. And similarly, if you consider a moral compass, for a moral compass to work and point to objective features about the world, we need two things. The first is you actually just need moral truth to exist out there. This is sort of like the magnetic fields that a compass would track. But that's not enough. You also need the compass to be able to point to these magnetic fields. It needs to have some sort of way of tracking it, so to speak. And the question is, how is it possible that our moral faculties are tuned in to receive these moral truths that exist out there? And it is for this reason that I think many atheists and naturalists are so skeptical of the idea of moral knowledge. And I think they're very justified in their skepticism here. Famous atheist J.L. Mackie writing, look, quote, "We have no philosophically satisfying account either of the existence of such things or of how we could come to know about them. Therefore, we should not believe in objective values." With this in mind, I think going forward, I'm only going to be considering the ontological or the moral fact piece, like the magnetic field piece. But keep in mind, even if the naturalists can posit the existence of moral facts, they still need to explain the second part, the epistemic part, how we come to know them. And at this point, we would say, look, it would be a really big coincidence that natural selection somehow caused our minds to arrive at moral truth or have some sort of capacity for doing so. And this becomes an even bigger concern when we don't have an entity like God who can intervene or create a conscience or a soul that could, in principle at least, track moral knowledge. So let's go ahead and take a second. Let me first look at naturalism. So naturalism is going to claim that all spatio-temporal entities must be identical to or metaphysically constituted by physical entities or somehow described by science. And this, of course, implies atheism because God, not being a physical being, would not exist under naturalism. So the first challenge to this view is G.E. Moore's open question argument. And the first thing we need to do is understand what an open question is. So let's start with an example of a question that's not open. The question, is 2 plus 2 equal 4, is not an open question because 2 plus 2 is logically equivalent to 4. And all we're simply asking is, is 4 4? And this is not an open question because this statement is obviously true. It's a tautology. Once you reduced an open question to some form like this, is A, it becomes a closed question because you get something of this form which cannot be false. So to Moore, a question is closed or just simply not open if both sides can be reduced to the same thing, because in that case, the answer, at least in this type of question, cannot be no. Now, Moore's point is, suppose that moral realism is true and consider the question X is good, where X is some natural property in question, like human flourishing. If that's the case, then we should be able to replace good, wherever we use the word good, with X and have the same thing. But what Moore wants us to do is look at the question, is it true that X is good? And really his point here is, if this is an open question, then it is not the case that goodness and X are the same thing, because this question should reduce to a closed question. But what Moore is going to argue is it doesn't. So his argument would go like this. Premise one, if X equals good, then the question, is it true that X is good, should be meaningless. But the question, is it true that X is good, is a meaningful question where X is, of course, some natural property. So therefore, goodness is not.
A few concerns here. One is, I don't know that I would characterize, is it true that X is good, as meaningless if X just like, is good? Like, is it true that good is good? That doesn't strike me as meaningless. That strikes me as like a tautological question. It'd be kind of pointless to ask the question, but is A equal to A, or is 3 equal to 3? That doesn't strike me as meaningless. Maybe a silly question, but not meaningless. So it's just a pedantic point. I probably wouldn't say that. But I want to hear more about, I basically want him to wrap up what he has to say about the open question argument before I give a couple comments on it. I do believe that Kane B has a video on the open question argument. Let me just confirm that, because I remember it being, I think, quite good and raising what I thought were some good objections. Let's see. It might be, yeah, I think it's Metaethics Moral Naturalism 1 from a few years ago. So yeah, I think it's his first video on moral naturalism. Okay.
Not reducible to any natural property, because this is not an open question. You end up getting a contradiction. Hopefully this is pretty clear.
You get it. Contradiction.
You could kind of ask, well, what kind of scientific test could you do to find out whether or not this thing was good?
He's drawing a distinction between like meaningful and meaningless, and then you would get that. Okay. I don't think that's the best way to make this point, but I think it's fine.
Obviously, the idea of goodness, or the word goodness, somehow captures something more than what we can reduce to naturally. And that's, I think, the first problem that we're going to have with these sort of naturalistic or atheistic theories of morality. Now,
Okay, so, part of my concern with the open question argument, I'm not going to say a whole lot about it here, is it doesn't strike me as decisive. It does strike me that I think it is reasonable to say, if someone says, hey, is X good? And they want to make a sort of analytic naturalist claim where they just want to say, hey, look, as a matter of conceptual analysis, like just when you analyze the meaning of the term good, and I mean good in a moral context, we don't have to be tricky here, morally good. So moral is in parentheses there. The concept of morally good, for instance, a person might analyze it as, well, it just means increases happiness or decreases suffering or whatever. And someone could say, well, does it mean that? Like, is that in fact what is good? Now, on the one hand, I do actually think that's a legit question. And I would kind of hope for an answer from someone that says that moral goodness just is, on conceptual grounds, identifiable with facts about what increases happiness or decreases suffering or whatever. Why should I think that? Like, how did they establish that? If they're making an empirical claim about how people use moral language, then I would predict that it would turn out that people don't consistently, uniformly, or sort of paradigmatically or primarily use moral language for that purpose. That would be an empirical battle you have to wage in the empirical literature. And yeah, I think anybody that was trying to reduce moral claims in a simple way, that would turn out to be false. There are ways of doing it that might be more sophisticated and complicated. Like if someone said moral language conforms to the distribution of linguistic outputs that would best accord with moral foundations theory or something like that. Maybe something like that could turn out to be true. And you'd have this kind of normative pluralistic system of moral concerns. And it would vary from one culture to another, but generally moral concerns would be like, they would be a dial up or dial down one of the 5 or 6 or however many foundations one would ultimately put forward with a sort of more complete or mature theory of moral foundations. So you could have something that would be more robust than it. You don't have to, on a naturalist account, reduce moral claims to something. It doesn't have to be happiness and suffering or just cooperation. It doesn't have to be simple. It could be complicated. So in those cases, though, that's probably, that might not be like analytic. It might not be something that you like discover is just part of the meaning of the terms. And part of the reason for that would, you might think, as a matter of sort of armchair analysis, we should be able to figure it out by just thinking about how we use the terms, one might think. And we haven't. And that might lead one to question that. But you could ask another question, which is, what patterns, regularities, or other sorts of natural phenomena motivate or prompt the use of moral language reliably in particular cases, but not other cases? And in those cases, if that's the case, you could have a sort of synthetic naturalist account where it's not so obvious. It wouldn't be obvious, or it wouldn't be a matter of a priori analysis to simply establish the factors that are causing us to use moral claims in a particular way. So you might say something like, look, you don't have to be an analytic naturalist and think that moral claims have to be analytically equivalent to some set of natural facts. You could say it's a matter of discovering what patterns, regularities, or causal factors drive or cause people to make the sorts of claims that they make. And, what if we discover, for instance, just to simplify things, that in virtually every, or we could say, in fact, as a matter of practice, in every case we observe moral systems or frameworks, what's causing people to employ those frameworks are like factors that are conducive to cooperation within those communities. And then you get something like Oliver Scott Curry's account or something like that. And in those cases, it might feel like, and genuinely be, sort of analytically an open question, or open seeming question, to say, well, are the moral facts in my society really about cooperation? And you would have to tell a story. And that's not to like say that there's anything bad about telling a story. You'd have to like make a case for saying, well, the reason why this moral system was developed as a matter of historical and psychological fact was because this system promoted cooperation within your community. And in that case, it's not a matter of analyticity. It's a matter of causal regularity or something like that. And then you could say, look, I'm actually saying, I'm not proposing that it's a matter of the meaning of the terms. I'm proposing it's a matter of something a bit different, where you could still sort of naturalize what's driving the claims without making it analytically equivalent. So I think it's probably not going to rule out certain types of naturalism. The other thing, though, is even if you wanted to be an analytic naturalist, there's already lots of philosophical terms or terms that could be used in a philosophical context, where one could ask a question like, is this true? Is that the case? Is this good? Is that right? And the answer would be yes. Or it could be no in some cases. And the issue there would be that I don't think it's always, it's not sort of like, it's not like every concept is transparent and self-evident to us, like what its meaning is. If that were the case, we wouldn't have to sit around, like philosophers wouldn't be sitting around going, well, what does justice really mean? So, they're not all going to be synthetic naturalists about the meaning of all these terms. They might just be trying to explore the content of the concept in a purely a priori way. And, the issue might seem open to people because they haven't thought about it enough. So here would be one possibility. What if it seemed to you that there was an open question about whether increasing happiness is morally good? And then you thought about it some more, you talked to some people, you didn't like utilitarianism, but you read a book on utilitarianism, you had some arguments, you wrote a couple philosophical papers, and eventually came around to going, I really think it is conceptually just the same thing, that moral facts are facts about what maximizes utility or whatever. So it didn't seem closed, but now it does seem closed. And I think that people can undergo that sort of experience by reasoning and thinking and working through philosophy. And so the fact that something seems open might be an artifact of their like lack of philosophical knowledge or their lack of adequate reflection. And upon reflection or upon further philosophical theorizing, it could come to seem like a closed question. So I think you would need to build a bit more into any sort of open question challenge that, honestly is going to start to turn on questions about introspective access to the content of our concepts, to, psychological claims about how people reason and think about things. And that is going to be a challenge for anybody that wants to do purely a prioristic or, rationalist approaches to philosophy that relies just on intuitions. You have these, when I say that, by the way, sometimes I see people say like, Lance thinks we should reject all intuitions or we shouldn't use intuitions. I do not think that. What I have a problem with is the uncritical overconfidence that many philosophers have in their intuitions and a sort of unregulated pass that they give themselves on treating any particular intuition as having any arbitrary amount of evidential force in any particular context. So they can always, put their intuitive thumb on the scales in any argument and say that this intuition overrides evidence to the contrary. And it could be reports or testimony about contrary intuitions, but it could be empirical evidence. So someone could, you could present someone a bunch of empirical evidence otherwise, and they could say, yeah, but my intuitions are stronger than the empirical evidence. So, you have this problem where I've called it an epistemic blank check, where people can, intuitions have this sort of they're inaccessible to other people, and they have a sort of inscrutable evidential role dialectically, where a person can always, there's all this sort of publicly available evidence, and you could sort of stack up the points for and against any particular view. And then a person can just add in their intuitions on the matter, and that could decisively resolve the matter in one or another direction, regardless of where the scales are balanced in any given instance. And I haven't seen a principled way of saying, hey, there's something wrong with that. To me, it actually looks very similar functionally to someone just saying, look, my prior is just set here. And your prior could be, asymptotically approaching 1 or 0 on a given issue, and then no evidence to the contrary in practice is ever going to persuade you. And I don't think there's a solution to that. I just think that that's a descriptive fact about people, that there's variation in their belief starting points on a given issue, and exposure to the same evidence will not lead everyone to converge necessarily, given some finite amount of evidence. Given maybe an infinite amount of evidence, you might expect all rational Bayesians to converge, but that's never going to happen in practice. So the same amount of evidence there's always going to be some proportion on one side and one side on the other. A proportion of people on one side and a proportion of people on the other side for any given issue, about which there's, enough variation around the mean or whatever. You could have a bunch of people bunched up on an issue where there's very little dissent from a particular perspective. Or, it could be that for some things, evidence is just too strong for or against a particular view. So, one where I think that you'll generally find convergence is like really trivial stuff like, does the sun exist? You probably have a couple people in the world that are like, the sun doesn't really exist or whatever. But for other issues, I think it might remain a matter of virtually intractable lack of agreement or lack of consensus, you could say, or at the very least, lack of unanimity. So it could be there's people believing in God 100,000 years from now and people that don't believe in God. And that might be fairly ineliminable without significant changes to human psychology. I mean, this is assuming people are around and we're still biologically pretty the same. But, if you get some transhuman future where people are radically different from one another, that might change. Who knows? All right. Yeah, so this is an interesting. So what if someone just thinks that for some X good is a closed question? It's a good point. And this is this dovetails nicely with my point about the intuitions on this matter. If someone has spent years and years and years studying moral philosophy, they might actually feel like hey, some deontological framework or some particular framework or whatever actually is a closed question. I have a suspicion, although I haven't seen surveys on this, that most moral philosophers, including ones that specialize in normative ethics, wouldn't say that. I think they would say, yeah, open questions about whether something is really good, morally speaking, do seem open, my guess. But you know what? I haven't seen survey data on that. That would be really interesting. Speaking of that, I'd have never seen any X-Fi research on the open question at all. It might be too arcane for non-philosophers, but that's never stopped experimental philosophers from throwing really bizarro questions at people. So I would be curious to see both how philosophers and non-philosophers would respond to a variety of open question arguments. It doesn't have to be about metaethics. This is a good question. Why is coincidence a bad point? I think it's going to run up against issues when you're trying to explain things where, if one account says, hey, I can explain why this phenomena or observation or whatever occurs. Here's the explanation for why that occurs. And another one says, yeah, it just happened to turn out that way, or it's total like these two things that happen to coincide perfectly. That's just a coincidence. So those ones, people would argue that there's something there's like a lack of explanatory virtue in that. There's something suspicious about that. So you'd be less suspicious of someone that could give a plausible explanation for why, if you said, hey, why are you wearing a watch that looks identical to my watch that went missing? And they said, because I saw your watch and I really liked it, so I went and bought one. Here's the receipt. That's a good explanation for why their watch looks like the one that yours went missing. If a person said, oh, it's just a coincidence, you might be a little more suspicious that they stole your watch. Maybe that's not the best analogy, but the rough idea there is that positing a coincidence comes at an explanatory cost relative to an account that can explain some observation or data point without just saying it's good luck. So that's I think roughly why. I don't know if that's the best explanation. Oh, right. Sapir asks, the word good captures more than what? I think I'm missing context for that. I'm not sure what you're asking about. Hiker says, seems like morality is something our brains come up with in response to genes, environmental, cultural pressure. Yeah, it's a question of whose brains come up with it. So I'm not even convinced every culture and society has had, quote unquote, morality. I do think every human society has had norms and institutions and means of promoting cooperation and regulating one another's behaviors and enhancing prosociality by minimizing conflict and that sort of thing. But I don't take every normative system to necessarily be a, quote, moral system. I think that Western conceptions of morality bake a lot into that notion that may or may not be present in other cultures' conceptions of the normative frameworks that they use for regulating the behavior within a society. Now, you could offer a stipulative or genuinely endorse a very broad account of morality that would encompass all cooperation promoting pro-social normative systems and institutions within, pro-social species with conspecifics living in close proximity or something. Like, you could give this really specific definition where anytime, two or more beings develop a set of principles for regulating, for minimizing conflict and enhancing cooperation, I'm just going to say that's a moral system. Well, then sure, all humans have had moral systems. But one could reasonably start by asking, well, what sort of actions, beliefs, behaviors, attitudes, phenomena, observations, whatever it is, that the term morality in like the English language, at least, what do they quantify over? What's encompassed by that? And, whatever the conceptual boundaries of that category are, how close do the terms in other languages approximate them? So, it's very likely that other languages have a fruit vegetable distinction that is really, really similar to the English fruit vegetable distinction in American culture in 2024. But I would bet you that if we went back 500 years, that categories and distinctions fluctuated a little bit. I don't know this. I'm just speculating in this particular case, but there are probably distinctions in other languages and cultures that I don't know about, where they don't carve up the, I guess you could say, like edible plant, that whole category of edible plants in quite the same way as like Americans in 2024 do, when they're speaking English. Like, there might be terms and categories and conceptual distinctions that are different. Now, those categories are sort of carving out the same set of things roughly, although there might be differences there too. Like in terms of what fruits and vegetables are the most common or the most available or whatever. But the point just would be that, like, if you drew sort of circles or complicated bubbles around the things in each category, how different would those have to be? Because if you had two societies and in one they considered everything a fruit except a tomato, and in another they consider tomatoes a fruit, and then otherwise the fruit vegetable difference is identical, they're basically using the same concept. But what if it's very different? So what if one society, instead of calling them all fruit, they had, one term for like sweet fruit, one term for like non-sweet fruit or something, or they put like all nuts or all things of a particular size, or all like maybe they put all citrus in one category, all non-citrus fruits in another category, and then everything else that's not a citrus or a fruit in a third category. Does fruit in that language mean the same thing as when I use the term fruit? Like sort of, it's like non-citrus fruit, but then there could be weirder ones where there's some other, like it could be based on some cultural role that that particular fruit play in a particular society, and that wouldn't be a natural feature of the fruits themselves. It would be some feature of the culture that is influencing their categorization procedures, and it's not carving nature disjoints. It's not a feature of the things themselves. And so then you could say a sort of a much more socially constructed category that's not as responsive to the natural properties of the things themselves. And in that case, seems like a different concept. And so the way that we carve up conceptual space when it comes to the moral domain, what if it's really different in other cultures? And, it doesn't look like philosophers seem very sensitive to those sorts of possibilities, that, there seems to be this presumption that everyone everywhere means basically the same thing by morality. And, if you take the standard sort of naturalist line, people might think that like moral cognition evolved, and I don't think that's true. And then other people might think that this is a sort of special sui generis autonomous category that one discovers via reasoning. And I don't think that's true. I think that the category of morality, like the moral domain, is a culturally constructed domain. I prefer to call it a pseudo domain because I think it actually is kind of like if a particular culture said we're going to categorize some fruits as having, we're going to use this term for some set of fruits and this other term for another set of fruits. And what's regulating that is like a buildup of historical like traditions or something like that. Particular rulers in that society prefer these fruits over those fruits. And so it's not a feature of the fruits. It's just a feature of like the arbitrary preferences of some dead ruler from 600 years ago. And so they call one set of fruits, like, let's say it's Emperor, Czar. And then they're like, these are all the Czarian things. And then these are the non-Czarian things, just to make it totally arbitrary. If that were the case, the Czarian things, there's nothing about them that distinguishes them from the other things that would like let scientists studying them 10,000 years later know. They would have to learn about the culture to learn that the culture treated them that way. And I think that some of the features of the way that we carve out the moral domain in Western culture are different from what one would find if one looked in other cultures. So in other words, I don't think it's like a sort of a natural domain. I think it's a constructed domain. And personally, I think that the moral domain, at least in modern Western society, has its roots in certain sort of like monotheistic and religious ideas. And that if you looked at other cultures, the way that they would ground the concepts governing normative discourse within that culture, they wouldn't have quite the same extension. They wouldn't have the same boundaries, and they wouldn't have the same properties that they arguably built into or were part of the structure of the concept. So there is a little bit of empirical research on this, and it does seem to support this. And philosophers don't seem to pay a lot of attention to it. There's something that strikes me about analytic philosophy, which, is this distinctively, Anglophone. It's English. It's not 100%, but that's a big part of it. There just seems to be this extraordinary cultural parochialism in how philosophers approach even concepts like that. Now, that is actually going beyond what I typically say about this. A lot of times what I talk about is philosophers reporting their intuitions on the matter. And so the content of their normative moral intuitions, I think, is culturally parochial. The presumption that they have that everybody speaks and thinks like a realist, that's culturally parochial. But I go further than that. And even the categories and domains they use, like, it's not just like if someone said, hey, well, in our culture, everybody likes apples more than bananas, so everyone everywhere likes apples more than bananas. That's the sort of, you could say, more object level or sort of first order cultural parochialism that I think infects analytic philosophy and is a problem. But then there's like a second order problem, which would be the very category or concept of a fruit could be culturally constructed. And philosophers might think everyone everywhere categorizes fruit and vegetables in exactly the same way. And that also could just turn out to be wrong. And so philosophers, it's just like an onion of presumptions that everyone everywhere speaks like philosophers do. And then almost all of these philosophers are from particular cultures, trained in particular cultures. You're already familiar with this. But, I think this goes all the way up. So Jack Easling asks, what do you think of Schaefer, Landau, Cuneo, and Bingson's view that moral truths are conceptual truths? That is, moral truths are not true in virtue of substantive facts in the world. I don't know enough about the view. I do know that I saw some interviews with Schaefer Landau maybe a couple years ago where he was talking about how they have a couple new books coming out. I did see a discussion where they talked about this view, and I had trouble making sense of this their use of this notion of data. Like there's this data and we have to explain it. It seemed like a metaphor or some sort of analog to scientific inquiry, but then they were proposing an alternative sort of distinctive philosophical methodology for addressing those questions. And to me, I had a lot of concerns about what they were doing there. But as far as them being conceptual truths, that just strikes me as like super duper implausible. I don't even know what that would mean exactly. But that's that. In this case, this is not to say it's not meaningful. It's just to say I haven't read it, so I don't know. If you want to elaborate a bit on the view, I'll do my best. Although, note to anybody, if Jack Easling, who posted this remark, does elaborate, and I'm responding to the elaboration, that may or may not, because obviously, if there's like a book or a paper, and someone gives you like a 3-sentence summary on YouTube, it may or may not be a comprehensive reflection of the view. So, but I'd be happy to try to address it. Jack continues, but rather moral truth is true in virtue of the constituent concept involved in it. It just sounds so at odds with how I approach things. Like it's true in virtue of the concepts. How like you like I have the concept of a unicorn. That nothing about the concept would like make it true. So how would the concepts make it true? Like what if you don't like how does that work? I don't know how that works. And like to me, concepts and whether the concepts are true or not are distinct in a way where, if someone said, but consider the nature of it, like is part of the concept of the moral facts that they're true? Like how is this supposed to work? I doubt that. But if that's the case, that strikes me as really implausible. So I would need to hear more about it. Oh, Sapir says he said something about the word good capturing more than something a few seconds back in the video. Okay, so let me see if there's a few more. Oh, there's quite a few more comments. So let me get through the comments and then I'll take it back a few seconds and then we'll continue with the video. Okay, so Jack continues. For example, recreational slaughter is wrong is true in virtue of the concept of recreational slaughter being such that anything satisfying it also satisfies the concept wrongness. Yeah, I'm probably not going to buy an account like that. So, I mean, you're going to have this issue where someone could just say, like, because imagine someone says, well, murder is wrong. And that's conceptually true in virtue of the constituent terms used in the sentence. And by murder, and let's just add explicitly morally wrong. Murder is morally wrong. And then I say, okay, well, and that's like trivially true. And then I ask you, well, why is it wrong? You say, well, note that murder like just means a morally unjustified, or we could say, just to really make the connection or the tautological nature of it tight, a morally wrong murder. A morally wrong homicide or morally wrong killing of a person. And then you could sort of translate it. And then you'd have a morally wrong killing of a person is morally wrong. Okay, well, that like, now that's like a tautology. So like, if they're trying to get at it in that way, that might be fine. But I mean, I would still have like, what do they mean by wrong? Why should I think that that's true? How do we like? Also, does this apply outside of any not like non-trivial cases, like where you don't want this to just always be a case where it's a tightly closed loop of things that another person happens to agree with, because what if the person? I mean, because a person could always make this sort of linguistic move where if you say, hey, murders are immoral killings, and so all murders are immoral. Okay, well, then a person could just end up disagreeing with you about what is or isn't a murder. So if they think, for instance, that killing people under a specific set of circumstances is not immoral, and then you say, well, murders are always immoral because they're immoral by definition. They could say, well, in that, fine, then I don't think that's a murder. And they could end up using a rather unconventional conception of murder, but it's not clear that they're making a mistake there rather than you making a mistake there, because there could be a clash of intuitions about whether, and it could be just a sort of recapitulation of the exact same clash you had prior to this sort of linguistic conflict that you're having, which is a conceptual conflict or an intuitive conflict about what you think is or isn't an immoral case of killing. And you're back where you started. And then they're just disagreeing with you on what counts as a particular application. Like they would say, this concept of murder doesn't apply in the circumstance. So, philosophers can always modus tollens instead of modus ponens. They can always do that. And so if someone is going to try to establish the moral truths by some sort of what to me looks like a, conceptual monopolization or a sort of a conceptual cannibalism, like this just amoeba just consuming certain terms, someone can just disagree on the instances in which one would apply the terms and preserve their views as they were previously. So I don't think this is going to get anybody anywhere. It looks to me like it's going to be a bunch of linguistic, the same kind of stuff that Wittgenstein would criticize, like just people getting tricky with language. So, but again, I would need to know more. I'm looking through questions now. Hiker comments, more cooperative pro-social cultures were more likely to survive and propagate than antisocial cultures, and maybe were the inheritors of those cultural mores. That's probably true. There's probably some degree to which people are predisposed towards cooperativeness. With, obviously there's variation in people's personalities. Some people are not so cooperative. All right. Jack asks another question. Since atheism entails nihilism, is logically equivalent with meaning requires theism, and the latter is clearly false, or has no sufficient reason in its favor, there being self-evidently no necessary connection between theism and meaningfulness? Isn't the former likewise clearly false, or is no sufficient reason? I mean, you're presuming that precisely what the person that would make that claim would disagree with, and what they're, presumably in the video, going to argue for. So I wouldn't say it's self-evident. I would be open to the possibility that, theism, you can only have meaningfulness with theism, but I would want to hear the argument for it. Jack asked question number 3. I love this. This is cool. Gives me stuff to work with. So thank you for all the questions. Would you extend your skeptical and relativist critique of moral concepts to normative concepts in general? The very idea of should, ought, epistemic, alts, prudential, good life. Yeah, a lot of them, yes. Maybe some of them I think would be more the kind of so like, you could, I at least do this, although I don't think it's like dispositive or settles the matter. I ask myself, like, what normative domains would we expect an alien civilization to have? To me, prudential norms seems pretty reasonable, like these like self-regarding norms about what furthers one's interests or something like that. Epistemic norms, that also seems fairly plausible, like norms governing like belief, something like that. Or knowledge, I guess you could say. Like they might have something similar to our concept of knowledge. That doesn't strike me as wild or bizarre. Maybe they wouldn't, but that strikes me as more plausible than that they'd have a concept of, morality, but they might not have either. And the concepts might be different enough in both cases. So yeah, it's going to be like a sort of case by case basis, the degree to which I'm skeptical. And none of these are going to be cases where I'm so confident that I'm like convinced the concept of morality is like totally culturally constructed. And there's no way someone couldn't make a compelling case that actually every human society has had something I would consider a moral system. I'm not as confident about this as I am that like there's not a lot of evidence that most people are moral realists or something. I think the evidence for that is stronger. But that's another case where the quality of and generalizability of available data isn't sufficient to be super confident about that. So confidence is going to vary from one claim to another. Yeah, so then Jack says, well, all tautological truths are conceptual truths. The converse is false. There are conceptual truths which aren't tautological. For example, something red all over isn't also green all over. I'm not sure that that's true. So I'm not sure that I buy into, like, you know, the synthetic a priori and that sort of thing. Yeah, so this is the sort of thing I should have used an even less controversial example. For example, slaughter is pro tanto wrong. Yeah, but there have been all sorts of cultures and societies where they would have been like, what do you mean slaughter is pro tanto wrong? Slaughter of who? It matters who you're slaughtering and why you're slaughtering it. Because there's been a lot of slaughter in human history, and I very much doubt all the people doing all the slaughtering thought what they were doing was wrong. They might have thought what they were doing was not wrong, or they might have thought it was good what they were doing. They might not have thought of it in terms of good or bad at all, morally speaking. They might have been like slaughter people and then thought it was awesome. I don't know. But you know, this again, I think people are reasoning too much from the comfort of contemporary perspectives on how to treat people. The whole world was way more brutal and harsh, and has become less so. You know, century after century after century, and I think especially, you know, since the mid 20th century, in certain parts of the world, like the United States, people have become way more averse to death and suffering and misery and harm and violence than probably any point in human history. And now the reasoning is though everything from that point of view is like obvious. And it's a point of view that like exists with where there's still a few people within living memory that didn't live in a culture like that. You know, there's people that are in their 90s and are 100 years old. And so people are reasoning, I think, from a very peculiar and distinctive and idiosyncratic cultural perspective that might be one of the least, if you look at historical periods and you have a sort of a weighted evaluation of them all by the amount of time rather than the total number of people, because like obviously there's more, as like the total population now is much larger than the amount that was sustained in the past. You just go like century by century and you gave like a permissibility or tolerance of brutality index, you would get it'd be like really high, really high, really high, really high, really high for like century after century after century. And then you know, you would see it would vary, but let's say it's like a 1 out of 10 scale, you'd be like 9, 8, 9, 8, 7, 9, 8, 7, 9. And then you get to like 20th century people in the United States that are watching me on YouTube and it's like a 2. And then they're like, this is all obvious. Everyone's always thought this way. And like, no, they haven't. No, they haven't. So I'm not suggesting that you think that way, but I often do have the impression that moral philosophers just can't reason outside of just an outrageously parochial way of thinking about the world. All right, Jack has another, it's question 3 follow-up. That makes it question 4. Don't you think some normative concepts are inescapable and necessary for all agents, including aliens? No. Why would I think that? Epistemic and prudential norms oughts seem inescapable to me. I don't know what you mean by inescapable. Do you mean the use of the category for an agent, or the sort of authoritativeness of the norms within the category? I'm presuming, given the context, that you mean the former. But I would reject. I mean, the second one I would definitely reject, but the first one I also reject. Moral oughts also do too. When agents live together in society, perhaps moral oughts could be thought of as a society's prudential ought. I wouldn't think of them that way. Yeah, I think that would be like too reductive and too inaccurate. So Nidhi says anachronistic modern morals are pretty much par for the course of Christian apologists. That's true, but I also think they're par for the course for academic philosophers in the analytic tradition. So, you know, I don't see a huge difference there. Okay. That gets us caught up. So let's keep going with the video.
Something to note that this actually works for divine command theory as well, because we can ask the question, is it true that God's commands are good? Because this is a meaningful question, this would show that God's commands can't
see, this is what's weird about this. What if someone endorses divine command theory and they say, look, you know, when you really sit down and think about it, what goodness is just is God's commands, because God, you know, In order for something to be objectively good, it has to like legislate or have authority or function like a law. The only meaningful way conceptually for it to function that way is for there to be a lawgiver. Laws just don't emerge from the ether. Now, I'm not buying into any of this, but someone could just reason this way. And then they could argue that that lawgiver is God. And so once you reflect on the nature of morality, what it means for something to be morally required or obligatory, permissible, or good, just is that it's commanded by God. And so, yeah, is it true that God's command is good? Actually becomes a nonsense question when you think about it. And it's just maybe people aren't thinking this all the way through. Like you could imagine a person that's like, well, it does seem like an open question whether a bachelor is an unmarried man. And because someone might think of, imagine a person's not super familiar. And so they think a bachelor is like a young man. And then you ask them like, well, this person is married. Could they be a bachelor? And they're like, sure. And you're like, whoa, hold up. What do you think bachelor means? And I'm like, oh, like a young man. You're like, no, it means like an unmarried man. And then they're like, oh, so, what if you're confused about your own concepts? Isn't that possible? What if you don't have a complete understanding of your own concepts? Why isn't that possible? We have to make some assumptions here about people's like access or use of the concepts before we could say that they've like correctly judged whether something is closed or not, or open or not. A person could just be mistaken. Nidhi asks, isn't that insanely circular? A moral thing is good because God says so, because God says so, it's good. So the sort of accounts that they're going to give are not quite so circular. They're going to run into problems where they push the circle downstream. So I wouldn't say it's a circle. I would say it's an oval. It's like a long loop. It's like a conveyor belt. But they're all going to run into issues. But the issue isn't it's good because God says so and God says so because it's good. They're not making a claim like that. What they might say is something like, God is love or something, or God is goodness. And like God has a certain set of properties like benevolence, righteousness, goodness, whatever. And so God's nature is the good. And so when God issues commands, there's certain entailments of God having that nature. And one of those entailments is that like God's only going to issue good commands. Like the commands are going to stem from a good nature infallibly. And so all the commands are going to be good. And then you should follow them because they're good. So something like that. So I don't think it's like obviously, it's not any less defensible than a lot of other meta-ethical counts. It's going to have it's a distinctive set of theological issues, but you're gonna run into issues with any secular realist account, non-naturalist account that I think are. I don't know. I'm not going to judge the relative plausibility of them, but it's not like theistic accounts are like obviously circular nonsense, and then the secular accounts like totally make sense. They all have like somewhere in the ballpark of similar types of issues.
Define what is good. However, divine command theory is not the way that theists or Christians have typically or even historically seen morality. What they've done is they've defined goodness in terms of God's nature. So this is how theists get around Moore's open question argument. The question, is it true that God has a good nature, would not be an open question because God is goodness himself. And to look more at this, you could look at Aquinas and at least I think 23 Bible verses that say something similar to this. And what theists are going to say is if God exists, then his nature serves as a ground.
Sapir, I forgot to take that part of the video back for you. I'm so sorry about that. And then that got me distracted and then I wasn't listening. So let me take this back. But not all the way. Too bad. You'll have to watch it later. But let me take this back.
Good, because this is a meaningful question, this would show that God's commands can't define what is good. However, divine command theory is not the way that theists or Christians have typically or even historically seen morality. What they've done is they've defined goodness in terms of God's nature. So this is how theists get around Moore's open question argument. The question, is it true that God has a good nature, would not be an open question because God is goodness himself. And to look more at this, you could look at Aquinas, and there's at least I think 23 Bible verses that say something similar to this. And what theists are going to say is if God exists, then his nature serves as a ground for good, which solves the grounding problem and also provides an objective supernatural teleology, which gets around Moore's problem and then also Hume's problem, which we'll talk about here in a second. Well,
I just like the idea that you're proposing an objective supernatural teleology to get around other problems, and like objective supernatural teleology, like this super heavy duty metaphysics, like just the heaviest, dutiest metaphysics of all in order to solve other problems. And it's like, okay, well, it almost feels like every philosophy has like this big trade-off thing, which is like the more metaphysics you bring in, you're resolving one set of problems, but you're introducing the others, and it's like all zero sum, and every position has an insurmountable set of problems, and it's just whack-a-mole with which problems you want to go with. That's how it feels to me, and it just feels futile to try to resolve this.
How can we get around Moore's question? Because this seems to be a problem for any type of morality. One of the things we're going to ask is, what the heck is goodness? Well, many people think that moral claims have a sort of prescriptive nature, an oughtiness, or a to-be-doneness. And that's actually...
So notice how people struggle to actually explain this like special authoritative nature of moral claims being prescriptive or having normative authority. Is they'll say they have like an oughtiness, or like Joyce and others have used terms like clout, oomph. Like there's something about like moral claims that's supposed to compel or push you in the way that a mere descriptive claim doesn't, or it really can't, independent of you caring about it. So these objective moral facts, some people just say, yeah, they're not connected to motivation. So it's not like in virtue of believing the fact you're automatically compelled to some degree to comply. But they do have this property that like you should comply with them independent of whether you want to. And when they have that property, that I think is the major issue. I don't think that even makes sense. Like, what is oughtiness? Like, it's a sort of it's almost like a metaphor or a conceptual extension of terms and concepts we are familiar with, and a redeployment of them in a philosophical context that I'm not sure it's meaningful. So we'll see. Well, let's address the question before we move on. Jack says, isn't it downright coherent? Do you mean downright incoherent? I haven't heard of too many people say downright coherent. I'm confident that you mean incoherent, but hopefully you'll confirm. Isn't it downright, I think, incoherent to say that God is goodness itself? Isn't it a blanket category error? The former is supposedly a concrete supernatural substance, the latter is supposedly a property. Yeah, incoherent. Thanks, Jack. So, yeah, I don't. So Christians will say stuff like God is love or God is goodness. And when they say that, that sounds really weird to me. Because like, let's say you have you have a friend, and your friend is the nicest person in the world. Well, you would think of them as like a person that has the property of niceness. So they're a person, and then one of the features about that person is that they are nice. But imagine if you said that, well, they are niceness. They are the concept, like they are niceness itself. That might be a way, like you could use that in a non-literal sense. Like if I said, imagine there was this like Conan the Barbarian Berserker, and you're like, Conan is violence itself. That is non-literal speech that's used to mean extremely sort of outrageously violent, just like so violent it's ridiculous. But that would be typically understood in almost any sane context. It's not like if you met Conan, you would say like, how do you have arms and a big axe? You are violence. Violence can't have arms and an axe. That doesn't make sense. Violence is a non-physical thing. I don't understand. No one would be confused about this, except maybe philosophers. They would be confused about it. But everyone else that hasn't studied enough philosophy to stop thinking properly, they understand that to be non-literal. So if Christians mean it non-literally, and they mean it metaphorically, what is it a metaphor for? And if they do mean it literally, then it sounds like nonsense. So if it's a metaphor, I don't know what it's a metaphor for. Does it mean just God is really, 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 really good? When you say God is goodness, or do you mean it literally? In which case, it sounds like nonsense. And yeah, it does kind of sound like a category error. It sounds ridiculous. So yeah, I don't know what they mean by that. They probably have a bunch of writing on this that tries to make sense of it. There's a good chance that there are a trillion, bazillion, billion pages on this in like Christian apologetics and philosophy of religion that someone somewhere would tell me this person's account solves the issue. And then another person would tell me another person's an idiot. It's actually this other account that solves the issue. And then the person supporting the first account would say, no, that other person's an idiot. And so it would be this just swamp of conflicting accounts. And then people would tell you that unless you read every single one of them thoroughly 6 times, you're not justified in making a judgment on it. Whereas I think I would look at the whole thing and think it's probably a bunch of nonsense, and that their remark that God is goodness is just nonsense. It sounds like nonsense to me. And let's be phenomenal conservatives. Seems like nonsense. I'm going to presume it's nonsense in the absence of defeaters. So if you have a bunch of good philosophy of religion stuff that makes sense of God as goodness, you could, you know what? I would love to have you on the channel. You could talk about it. You could send me an email if you don't want to go on the channel, but I want to hear from people that have read about or understand like the God is goodness type stuff, or God is love. Doesn't make sense. God is love. What the hell? And probably it's going to turn on some weird notions about like God's properties of nature. Like God is the ground of all of these things. And so God can be love and goodness and whatever. So it's going to be something like that. Some metaphysically dubious stuff that I'm not going to be able to, I'm not going to find it plausible at the very least. Yeah, so response to skepticism about oddiness. To illustrate to you how it makes sense, consider you ought to believe in whatever there is most reason or evidence to believe. Yeah, but I can make a claim like you should believe whatever there's most evidence to believe, and I don't need oddiness or realism to do that, or some sort of irreducible normative notion. Yeah, again, so like Jack also says, or you ought to believe plate tectonics and ought to disbelieve in young Earth creationism. I think that only anti-realist characterizations of these views make sense. Oh, I got to check something. Give me 1 second. 1 second. That whole thing with the webcam like randomly shutting down is just so frustrating. I'm going to have to get that fixed. Yeah, this is why we need Danny to come on the channel. So Sapir says channeling Danny Phil talk. Yeah, see, this stuff about grounding, I've never understood why this is supposed to be a thing that we need. You need to ground the moral facts. So Nexus says, Nexus 26 says, I think that nothing grounds objective moral facts. They probably just float free as brute facts in a Platonic way. See, I don't get that either, though. So float free, like, again, it's a metaphor, and a metaphor for what? Like, I don't even know if I think there are brute facts or things floating free in a Platonic way. There's just all the metaphysics. Just we need to put it on a boat, ship it out to sea, and hopefully it won't come back. All right, let's keep going.
Is to say moral claims are prescriptive and natural claims are descriptive. So when I'm saying X is good, I'm saying you ought to do X. And when I'm saying Y is evil, I'm saying you ought not to do Y. So somebody who's convinced by this idea that moral claims are basically prescriptive in nature would basically say, is it true you ought to do what is good? This would not be an open question, because if goodness reduces to just what you ought to do, then these two are the same thing, and this is not an open question. So basically what you end up getting is this idea that if atheism is true, everything can be described by science. Science can only tell us.
Look at that first premise. Why would you accept that? I don't accept it. Atheism is true. Everything can be described by science. And it's really going to matter what we mean by described by science. Because if you said something like everything can be addressed empirically, I'm an empiricist, but I don't think that like, you also have this natural language. When you convert natural language into syllogisms, you have to be careful about conditionals because conditionals function a little weirdly. So like, here's a funny thing that I noticed, and I gave this example. Oh, let me see if I could remember the example. So I think my example was this. If I'm a banana, then God exists. I am a banana, therefore God exists. Now, that's a modus ponens argument, a perfectly valid argument. Now, here's the funny thing about the argument. You really only have like, if you want to engage argument, you could always just say, I don't accept like I'm not going to consider the argument. I refuse to render judgment. You could make all these sort of like you're not playing the logic game type moves, and that's all fine. Never mind those. Let's say you play the logic game. You're going to assign truth values to the premises and see what conclusion you're stuck with, and then you're going to accept the conclusion or whatever. You got a few options here. You could assign truth to both premises, false to both premises, or true to the first and false to the second, or flip it, false to the first, true to the second. Now, here's the thing. Of those four options, if you assign true and true, got no problem. You got a straightforward argument for God that you accept. If I'm a banana, then God exists. I am a banana, so God exists. So if you think I'm a banana and you think that if I'm a banana, God exists, then you're logically compelled to think that God exists. No problem. I mean, it's a ridiculous argument because I'm not a banana. But like that's one argument you could go with, and it's a silly one. But the point is, it's valid even though it's not a sound argument, because the second premise is false. But one thing you can't do is say both of the premises are false. And the reason for that is that gives you a contradiction. And you could do this by drawing out a truth table. And in other words, you assign like assuming this is true and this is false, like what happens with the first conditional. And so the way that conditionals work is it's only going to be false if the conditional is like F and T. So if something false, then something true. But if you have, if T, then F. But in all the other cases, it's going to be true. So only one of the four cases, my bad, I mixed them up. In only one of the four cases is a conditional not going to be true. And it's going to be true in all the other ones. And so what ends up happening with the way that a modus ponens works is if you reject the second premise, you're sort of logically compelled to accept the first premise is true. And so you would have to accept if you deny him. In other words, if you deny him a banana, then you're obligated to accept the conditional that if I am a banana, then God exists, which sounds ridiculous. But part of the problem here is because when you use the natural language phrase, like if I'm a banana, then God, it seems like I'm saying that like it's necessarily the case, like that you've got to believe, that there's some connection between my banana-ness and God's existence. But you kind of don't. You could reject that and you can still be stuck with having to think that that's like technically true. So for instance, if you think God exists, that's the whole thing's going to be true, right? So you end up getting stuck with that. And this actually parallels like William Lane Craig's version of the moral argument. Logically, you can't assign false to both premises because it's a modus ponens. So you're actually stuck either accepting both premises or at least one. Basically, you have to accept at least one of the premises of a modus ponens. So you get this weird thing where depending on what you end up responding to this argument, you might be sort of logically compelled to accept that first premise, which could be really misleading because it's making it seem like atheism entails that everything can be described by science, even if that wouldn't technically be true. In other words, like, the fact that probably most of you don't think I'm a banana, it doesn't really entail that if I'm a banana, then God exists. But you have to accept that the way that a conditional works in that syllogism, because that's actually how the operators in a conditional actually work. In other words, they work in a way that I think a lot of people would say, that's not what I mean. I'm not committed to that. And it's because there's, natural language doesn't map on to really basic logic super well in every single case. I think KV and maybe other people have had some pushback. No, I think they were just arguing. Someone I think said, well, it shouldn't be that way. And actually, I think, so never mind, I take it back. There's reasons why it works this way. I don't know exactly what they are, but I don't have any problem with logic working that way. Any particular system of logic, it works the way it works. And if you don't like the rules, you can always come up with another system of logic. It's not like you're stuck with, any type of classical logic. You could come up with some non-classical logic and do whatever you want and see how far that gets you. So I think classical logic has served people pretty well. It helps us clarify arguments and see the paths in our reasoning and where they lead, and it seems good to me. So I don't have an issue with it. But you do get like little quirky implications like that sometimes. All right.
What is, not what ought to be. Now, this is Hume's famous is-ought distinction. And thus, if everything can be described by science,
Yeah, so there's this could be formalized a little better because you want to preserve the exact wording and the terminology between the premises. Yeah, it is a conditional and a conclusion. I mean,
science, there cannot be any objective ought claims. If there are no objective ought
and it's flagging like a sub-conclusion as a premise.
claims, then moral realism.
I don't think I'm going to stop and work my way through this. I would want to like write it out and talk it out and try to formalize this and assign variables. I'm not going to try to do it in real time.
Is false, and therefore, if atheism is true, then moral realism
Ask yourself,
is
would have
false.
no problem
You
with
don't
this.
get to ground the
Like just going boom, 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 and being done.
Existence, the ontological piece of morality in something like God's nature.
Let's see. Yeah, so the idea here would be something like, look, if atheism is true, then you're going to have basically this naturalistic worldview where basically it's something like this. If atheism is true, you've only got descriptive claims. The moral facts are prescriptive claims. So if atheism is true, you're not going to be able to have moral realism. That is what this is arguing. And I think at least among academic philosophers, and this is the standard response people give to stuff like the moral argument, they're just going to deny that atheism is going to commit one to moral realism being false. And in this case, they're going to deny the sort of things that would entail that moral realism is false. So they're going to deny that atheism entails that everything can be described by science. Someone could argue that it's consistent with science for there to be like irreducibly normative or you could say irreducibly prescriptive claims. It's like some naturalists might argue that. I think a lot of people might not argue that. So what they would do is just reject the first argument. The first premise. What am I talking about? So I think a lot of people for this would just reject the first premise. I think that's probably where people go. So I'm interested in the audience. Is there anybody that accepts all the premises to this argument? And if so, I'd be curious to hear from you. But if you do reject one or more premises, which premises do you reject? I think from looking at this, and we haven't even formalized this to assess its validity, but I'm inclined to just say I wouldn't accept the first premise. But I'm curious, what you think. If atheism is true, everything can be described by science. So, I mean, this is really going to turn on whether you think everything can be described by science, at least for me. And let's say I accept that. Okay, so everything can be described by science. All right, let's say I'm just going to say everything can be described by science, very broadly construed. So I end up accepting the first premise. And then, let's see. Science can only tell us what is, not what ought to be. So if we say something like, if atheism is true, there are only descriptive facts. Well, that's not exactly how I translate that. Let's see. If atheism is true, everything can be described by science. Science can only tell. Okay, so if atheism is true, man, I would want to reword some of these. If atheism is true, everything can be described by science. If everything can only be described by science, you might say, then there are only descriptive facts. Maybe that might be a better way to phrase that. Yeah, you could probably cut this down into something like, let's see. If there are only descriptive facts, then moral realism is false. I'm not going to try to restructure it in real time, but there's probably a way to do it where it would, I think, flow a little more smoothly. But if you accept the first premise, let's see, science can only tell us what is, not what ought to be. Let me just take these as isolated and see where we go with them. So let's say I just think, yeah, if atheism is true, everything can be described by science, just for the sake of argument. Fine. And then I say, okay, well, science can only tell us what is, not what ought to be, because I have this like naturalistic worldview, and I think that science just tells us what is the case. And since I think everything that there is can only be described as is claims, fine. So I accept the second premise. Thus, if everything can be described by science, then there cannot be any objective ought claims. Yep, that seems fine. So you accept that. So if there are no objective ought claims, then moral realism is false. Then you say fine. then that wouldn't be an issue. Like, yeah, so then if atheism is true, then moral realism is false. That's not going to strike me as a big problem, but it's not going to strike me as a big problem because I would think basically like I would also agree that if theism is true, moral realism is false. So like whether moral realism is false for me isn't conditional on whether atheism is true. I think it's sort of false unconditionally, at least not conditioned on atheism. So this isn't going to strike me as a big problem, but I think that so the issue is that anybody that's going to find this conclusion unacceptable is just going to reject the first premise. I don't know. I don't think we need to dwell on it too much beyond that. So we have a few comments from people saying, I don't know how to fully accept the first premise. I don't accept premise 1. He seems to be implying scientism. I don't accept premise 1 and premise 2. Not sure what you mean by that. Sabir says, depending on what it actually means by what is. So Chris Taylor says, yeah, I'm not a moral realist anyway, so it feels a little issue if moral realism is false. Right. So that's the problem. So if you reject the consequent, then a lot of the way that conditionals end up working is going to end up being a little weird for conditionals. So and then you could end up like agreeing with an argument, but it seems like you're agreeing to like really weird conditionals that like the natural language analog you wouldn't accept, but once you ratchet it into these types of syllogisms, then you would accept it. So like, for instance, I'll give you an example, the moral argument. So take some argument like what is the standard Craig formulation? I think he does it weird because he has negations in it. I'm pulling up the Craig moral argument. Here it is. I'll post it in the chat. So, so that argument, premise 1 of that argument is if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values do exist. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. So the issue with that would be that I would reject the second premise, objective moral values do exist. And so that would mean I've got to accept the first premise, which is that if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. You see the issue there. I think objective moral values do not exist. But once you ratchet it into a modus ponens, what you can see is that because I reject the second premise, objective moral values do exist. That means that in order to have, to reject the argument without there being a contradiction, that I have to assign a truth value to the first premise, which means I actually have to accept the premise, if God does not exist, objective values do not exist. But that makes it seem like I'm saying that moral realism is dependent on whether God exists. And so there's an implication that you need God for moral realism to be true. But I don't think that you do need God for moral realism to be true. I think that moral realism would be false either way. And yet that premise makes it look that way. And that's because, technically speaking, the way that conditionals work is that as long as you reject that second part, the whole thing is going to come out to be true. So that's just the way that they work. Let me just give you this. Sorry, I keep getting them flipped around. And this is what's annoying when I try to do logic in real time. So it's not as long as you reject the second part. Let me just share this. So the way that a conditional turns out to be false is only if the antecedent is false and the consequent is is true and the consequent is false. So if you have like P then Q, this is going to turn out to be false if the first part is true and the second part is false. So in other words, like you have if something is true and then it entails something that's false, then you're going to get something that's false. But check out what happens if you have if P then Q, P therefore Q. If, and this is where things get weird about it, if you assign, and this is, Craig's is a little weird because of the negations, so you'd have to move some things around. So we'll actually go with my God banana example. So if I am a banana, then God exists. I am a banana, therefore God exists. Now, is there a way for me to draw on the screen? Because that would make it a lot easier. So here's what happens with this. If you deny that I am a banana, what ends up happening is that you assign a false in the first conditional. And if you look at, so let me see if I could just share this screen. There we go. Cool. Check it out. So this is the truth table right here for conditionals. And notice that they only turn out to be false if the P is true and the Q is false. Otherwise, they're always true. Always true. And that's true not just if it's TT, but even if it's FF or FT, you're still going to get true. And so what happens with the bonus ponens, like if I'm a banana, then God exists, I am a banana, therefore God exists, is that if you reject the second premise, I am a banana, notice that that's P. P stands for I am a banana. And so now the only way for you to reject the second premise, P, is to assign a false to it. But what happens when you assign a false to it? Well, look at the truth table for the conditional. If you assign, you have to assign the same truth value in both premises. So if I am a banana is false, then the first part, the P in if I am a banana, then God exists is false. And so what you have is an F. And as long as you have an F, notice FT, true. FF, still true. So it no longer matters what is in the Q. So it doesn't matter if God exists. You could literally put anything you want in there. It could be the universe will explode in 14 seconds. It could be anything you want. Doesn't matter. If you reject the second premise, the first premise is going to be true. And this works in reverse too. So if you accept this premise, to be true, then automatically, so let's see how that would work. If you accept this premise to be true, then let's see what happens. You would have to, so the accepted is true. I did out the truth table to see the contradiction, but I'm trying to see what would happen here. So if you accept that this is true, well, we could go with saying that the other one is, let's see how you would show that. So if this one is true, there'd be a bunch of conditions under which this could be true, and you'd have to explore each one. Okay, so if this one is true, and remember, this is assuming you want to reject the conclusion. So if you go with TT, what happens is if you accept P and Q are both true, then obviously you're going to accept the second premise is true as well. And if you want to reject the conclusion, you're not going to want to do that. Like, in this case, if you want to deny that God exists, you're not going to be able to do that. And the reason you're not going to be able to do that is because you've assigned truth values to P and Q. And so if you've accepted the first premise because you think that P and Q are both true, then obviously P is true. So you've accepted both premises because the second premise is P. You could go with the second one, then you're going to be able, then that's when you're going to run into an issue. But then look at the other two. So if you have F then T, so now you're saying that P is false, then you're not going to have a huge problem. You've accepted that this premise is true, but that means that P is false. And then for the fourth premise, if you accept that, you think they're both false, then again, you're accepting that the second premise is false. But in both of those cases, you have to accept the first is true. So notice that in all three cases where you accept that the first premise is true, you either are going to accept, you're going to end up accepting that in the first case, if you accept that that the first premise is true, then you're going to be stuck with the second premise being true as well. And again, if you want to reject the argument, you're not going to want to do that. So you're not going to want to choose that. For the third one, if you accept the premise is true for that reason, then you're going to say that the second one is false, but then this one is true. So you're stuck with one of the premises being true, and the same thing for the fourth one. If you accept F and F, then and that being true, wait, so that gives you two Fs, and so that would give you a true, right? And so then the second premise again would have to be false. And so notice in all of those cases, it's either both of the premises are true, or the second premise is going to end up being true. Well, wait a minute. I see. Sorry, the first premise is going to be true. See how I get mixed up about this? So it's only the second one that you're going to be able to go with for this. Then if you want to assign this to be false, notice what you have to do. You have to say that the second premise is true. So you see how there's no way around it. You have to accept either the first premise is true or the second premise is true. You're stuck with one or the other. It's pretty cool. I like that feature of modus ponens. I think it's really cool. So I massively overcomplicated this, but the basic idea here is just your options are accept both premises, or accept the first premise and reject the second, or reject the second, or sorry, reject the first and accept the second. If you reject both, you end up with a contradiction. All right, and then I absolutely lost my original video. There it is. Where am I at? Ah, here I am. Okay. Oh, I'm not sharing the original screen. There we go.
If this ontological piece of oughts requires something supernatural.
I'm sorry, I started again, but after I diverged, I really wanted to go over that because I do think that that's a weird feature of modus ponens that I find a lot of fun that I guess I never really thought about. And it's because, when you study philosophy, I took some logic courses, didn't use a lot of formal logic a whole lot, and then you get really rusty with it. And that's why, it's easy to trip up over the language, especially in this case. It's really easy to trip over the language because first premise, second premise, and you get them all flipped in your head, and the negations all get flipped in your head. And a lot of this stuff is stuff that when it's really easy to work it out on paper, but I'm not as fluid in talking about it because I don't talk about it as much. So you see, I kind of step over my words, and I'm like, in real time, I'm like, wait, is that, no, it's flipped around. So that just happens a lot when you don't do this a lot. And this is one reason, someone like Ask Yourself is like, look, you got to work on formalizing things and doing formal logic because, if you don't make a habit of doing it regularly, you could get you could make mistakes in real time. And it can often, like in this case, it would take a little bit of work to sit down and formalize this because I don't do it often enough. And people like Ask Yourself that do, I think, would do this in a few seconds. And that could be really, really helpful when you're trying to follow, when you're trying to track what someone's saying and they have this complicated line of inference, or they're saying things that are really ambiguous. And you're like, look, I'm just trying to turn this into a modus ponens or a modus tollens or something simple. That could be complicated when they're not recognizing, like, preserving similar terminology across one premise to the next and changing the terminology around, or flipping things and or inverting things, or using sentence structures where you have to sort of flip around the grammar of it just to figure out what's being said. Then you want to get symbols to represent things, turn things into P's and Q's, and then you want to line it all up and see what you're working. And even then, then you have to just, try to remember how to what's going to follow from particular truth tables, and whether you would end up getting a contradiction if you go one way or another. And so all that stuff can be extremely helpful in disambiguating what someone's saying and working it out in real time. And I just don't do it enough. And so I flub over and goof when I'm covering this. But I think if I did this a second time, it would be a lot more fluid, So it's a kind of goofy thing that I'm making myself do, even though it's outside my comfort zone. I'm not just talking metaethics. So, but I think it's important. I think it's important to do that. So Chris Taylor says, yeah, that was a nice explanation. Thanks. I don't think it was. I think that I kept flipping like the T's and F's in my head, and then just getting myself mixed up, and then I had to keep self-correcting, and I hate doing that. It's awkward. Anyway, but I'm not going to waste time on being clunky because I am, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm not. I do a narrow set of things for way too long, and that's something I need to work on. So cool. All right, let's go back to the video, and I'll take it back a few seconds.
Realism is false. You don't get to ground the existence, the ontological piece of morality in something like God's nature. If this ontological piece of ought requires something supernatural, you can't get it from atheism, or you can't get it from naturalism, would be the way this argument would kind of go. So there's two versions of this argument that I think are pretty clear, that hopefully show where the argument would go. The first is, look, if moral statements are true, then objective ought-based claims exist. Premise 2 would say if objective ought-based claims exist, then naturalism is.
That's a really weird way to phrase it. If moral statements are true, then objective ought-based claims exist. The claims exist, like objective ought-based claims exist. It's weird to call them that, say the objectivity applies to the claim. That's a little ambiguous. Moral statements are true, then objective ought-based claims exist. What?
Is false. This assumes is ought distinction. Then the first conclusion, if naturalism is true, then moral realism is false.
Let me take that back. That sounds
show where the argument would go. The first is, look, if moral statements are true, then objective ought-based claims exist. Premise 2 would say if objective ought-based claims exist, then naturalism is false. This assumes is ought distinction. Then the first conclusion, if naturalism is true, then moral realism is false. Then we basically say, look, if moral realism is false, then moral nihilism is true. And therefore, if naturalism is true, then moral nihilism is true. The second version of this argument is based on Moore's open question argument, and it goes like this. Premise 1, if naturalism is true, then moral claims cannot be reduced to natural physical phenomena. Premise 2, if moral realism is true, then moral claims cannot be reduced to statements about natural phenomena. And then as a result, if naturalism is true, then moral realism is false. And using the premise from the previous argument, if naturalism is true, then moral nihilism is true. And lastly, you can take these kind of natural arguments and turn them into an argument around atheism. You can
So a little weird.
And say, look, if God does not exist, there's no grounding for the ought-based nature required for objective morals.
There's so many assumptions here, and there's so many cases where the imprecision in the language is really causing a hang-up for me.
Base claims exist, then naturalism is false. This assumes is ought distinction. Then the first conclusion, if naturalism is true, then moral realism is false. Then we basically say, look, if moral realism is false, then moral nihilism is true.
That's that. I mean, so
True.
Should we accept that? What is meant by moral nihilism here? Is it just the negation of moral realism? And if so, why? So, philosophers will often use nihilism synonymously with error theory, but this seems to be using nihilism to encompass any anti-realist account, and that's somewhat idiosyncratic.
Therefore, if naturalism is true, then moral nihilism is true. The second version of this argument is based on Moore's open question argument, and it goes like this. Premise 1, if naturalism is true, then moral claims cannot be reduced to natural physical phenomena. Premise 2, if moral realism is true, then moral claims cannot be reduced to statements about natural phenomena. And then as a result, if naturalism is true.
See, look at, so moral claims can be reduced to natural physical phenomena, and then the moral claims cannot be reduced to statements about natural phenomena. So in some cases, the claims are being identified with the things they refer to, and in other cases, it's sort of preserving that we're talking about the properties of the claims and not the properties of the things the claims refer to. But that's shifting from one premise to the next in the exact same argument. So you see what I'm saying? So immoral claims cannot be reduced to natural physical phenomena. So the claims are being reduced to natural physical phenomena? Because like a claim clearly is a physical phenomena. Like it's wrong to murder. Like that's a physical phenomena that occurred. Like I made sound waves with my mouth. Unless the claims, like you're Platonist about the claims and the claims aren't natural phenomena, this is just not clear. why is it sometimes the claims are see, the moral claims can be reduced to natural physical phenomena, but in the second premise, if moral realism is true, moral claims cannot be reduced to statements about natural phenomena. Why is there a slide between the two?
True, then moral realism is false. And
naturalism is true, the moral claims can be reduced to natural physical phenomena. And then there's probably it's like an enthymeme. There's like unstated premises here, probably based on previous things that were stated. But you would want to lay it all out. This just seems a little rushed. Like I feel like this could be formalized in a way that's a lot smoother to process.
And using the premise from the previous argument.
Right. So like Ismail, is that how I say your name? Sorry if I didn't get it right. In what sense is premise one and premise two combined here? Yeah, good question. Like you would have to ask some more questions or work it out. And it's just like, that seems like a bit of work to do.
If naturalism is true, then moral nihilism is true.
And then
lastly,
you couple that with like the nihilism being used synonymously with anti-realism here, and it's a little weird.
You can take these kind of natural arguments and turn them into an argument around atheism. You can say, look, if God does not exist, there's no grounding for the ought-based nature required for objective moral values to exist. If there is no grounding for objective moral values, then moral realism is false. If moral realism is false, then moral nihilism is true. And therefore, if atheism is true, moral nihilism is true. And perhaps one of the ways you can kind of turn this question around is just saying, look, if God's nature isn't going to ground moral truth, what the heck is? Once again, we can say that goodness exists if and only if God exists. So if God does not exist, which is of course what atheism asserts, there's no such thing as moral truth, and thus moral realism is false and moral nihilism is true. Now let's go over a few possible objections that I think are worth mentioning. The first one, I think this is perhaps the most obvious one, is just saying, look, is God's nature good is an open question. And obviously the theist is going to argue this is not the case, in part because they see God as that, which is the source of goodness. But I can understand why somebody would be skeptical of how goodness comes from God's nature. But this is a topic for another video. This is one on divine nature, because this kind of misses the point. If this succeeded the way somebody posing this thinks it true, whether atheism or theism is true. So it would still be the case that atheism implied moral nihilism by the previous types of arguments. It would just simply say that theism needs to do more work to solve the grounding problem. In this case, if this question actually succeeded, or this argument succeeded to say, is God's nature good, was an open question, basically whatever grounds goodness is an open question for the naturalist or atheist, which would still be true regardless of whether the atheist thinks God is a suitable grounding under theism. Second question I often hear is, well, why should I do what is good or what I ought to do? Now, notice how this is a different question, though, and arguably a red herring. It's asking for a practical reason for morality, not a logical one. The question we're asking is whether moral obligations exist, not whether or not one cares enough to follow them. This is like asking when someone presents a proof, why should I care about math? Or more generally, why should I care about what is true? Now, I think it's a fair question, but it's a different question, and one that in my view would need to come down to practical reasons, not the kind of logical reasons we're asking about here. I'm kind of assuming that people care about truth and finding the right answer here. This is a different type of question, which is the sort of actual behavioral piece of it. The third question you may hear is, well, why does it matter if, as I'm going to claim, atheists can be just as good as theists? And my response to this is what we believe actually matters. This is what I believe. To claim it doesn't matter is like saying it really doesn't matter whether one's an atheist or a theist at all. And I'm sure, many atheists at least claim that it matters that they're an atheist, at least perhaps it does. So to me, I think our beliefs matter more than just what the effects of them are. And having true beliefs is somehow better than having false ones. Still, I think the fact that many Christians do not live their lives as if Christianity is true is a serious problem, and one that I think Christians need to take very seriously. I mean, I think there's something to be said of the atheist who goes up to the Christian and says, well, hey, wait a minute. If you believed all this stuff, shouldn't your life be just radically different? Shouldn't this change every single facet of your life? And which I would say, yeah, I think it totally should. Still, I think the question that I'm asking isn't strictly about behavior itself. It's about the rationalities of beliefs and the subsequent rationality of actions under a given set of beliefs, not about just the actions themselves.
Yeah, I just, atheists have a lot of potential responses here. Atheists can reject naturalism and just, endorse some non-naturalist conception of moral facts. So that sort of implodes the argument behind the whole video. So atheism implies moral nihilism. I mean, if we go all the way back to this notion that if you're an atheist, you're gonna, what was that original premise? where are we at now? 21:15. So
Atheism, or
if we go back to this, if atheism is true, everything can be described by science. So you have a few issues here. I mean, first is that naturalists are going to have all sorts of responses, and so even if someone accepted premise one, and they say, look, I'm an atheist and I think everything can be described by science, and so I'm fine with saying if atheism is true, everything can be described by science. Someone might actually think that, and if they do, the naturalist is going to have a whole bunch of responses where basically what they're going to deny is they have a few things they could deny. One of the things they could say is that moral facts don't have to be sort of, you could say, irreducibly prescriptive. They could be descriptive facts. That's one possible way that you could get objective moral facts and be a naturalist and an atheist. In that case, atheism wouldn't entail nihilism, which here is like basically seems to be equivalent to anti-realism, because you have a naturalist realist account. They might also think that you could, in some fashion or manner, render prescriptive or irreducibly normative claims consistent with the natural sciences. And in that case, they would just deny one of the other premises. They could say, look, sure, if atheism is true, then everything can be described by science, but science, it turns out, can describe these irreducibly normative facts in some fashion. So then they would reject it for that reason. But I suspect most people are just going to reject the first premise and just say, there's actually some stuff that can't be explained by science. That doesn't mean that I necessarily would, because I'm an empiricist, and so if by science you mean like, because when people say things can be described by science, like I don't describe like what's in my cup, scientific. Like I'm not getting out a microscope. I'm not doing a bunch of science to figure out what's in my cup. I'm using conventional inferential procedures. Like I know that this is like seltzer water, and I have good reason to think that the can of seltzer water that I opened and poured into the cup was filled with actual seltzer water, wasn't something else. And so I'm making various types of empirical, inferential, like I'm making inferences based on empirical observations. Is that science? So if so, then yeah, everything can be explained by science, in the sense that it could be explained empirically. But if you have a more narrow conception of science where you're employing some distinctive set of methods or tools or epistemic resources that are not exhaustive of all empirical methods, then yeah, lots of stuff can't be explained by science. But that actually, wouldn't entail that you're not a naturalist. What makes it funny is that I'm not a naturalist anyway. But like, again, it just depends on like the demarcation, like where you're drawing what is and isn't science. And if you draw it broadly, then I would say, yeah, everything can be described by science. But if you draw it more narrowly, then I wouldn't. So there are going to be some potential concerns there. But I'm perfectly fine with saying if atheism is true, you're going to end up with anti-realism. I would just also raise concerns about whether you could end up with anything other than anti-realism if theism is true. And it's really going to depend on their construal of theism. Now, you have a few issues here. So if the reasons why the theist is rejecting the consistency between atheism and realism is because they think atheists are basically stuck with naturalist views, which I don't think is true, but let's just suppose that they did think that, and they think all the naturalist views of realism are wrong, fine. Then we have to switch over to the non-naturalist views, and if those are false or unintelligible, in a way that doesn't, like, it's not like the existence of God is going to make the unintelligible intelligible. So that's going to be an issue. If non-naturalist accounts are unintelligible, they're still going to be unintelligible even if God exists. Like, the existence of God isn't going to make square circles any more, any more logically possible. There's still going to be nonsense. And the existence of God couldn't make like a nonsense sentence like flibberty bibbity boo any more meaningful. If it's not meaningful, it's not meaningful. God is not going to change that. So if it's unintelligible, God's existence isn't going to matter one way or another. So then it would be the case that if God exists, anti-realism is true. If God doesn't exist, anti-realism is true. They're both going to be true. Anti-realism is true either way. Now, if realism is false for whatever reason, it's somehow intelligible, not naturalistic, but false. I would want to know how God is supposed to like help the matter, like make it less plausible that it's false. You may have these like epistemic possibility type claims where someone is saying, well, conditional on God's existence, it's more likely for realism to be true. But that's like supposing that we don't have a good analysis of what's meant by. So, the naturalistic accounts aren't going to need God and God's not going to help them. So like maybe like, let's just say some naturalist account, because the naturalist accounts don't tend to be unintelligible. I just think they're trivial. Those accounts can be true, but they don't benefit from God existing. And so God's existence doesn't make them more probable. If God's existence makes non-naturalist accounts more probable, I just want to know how. Like, why should I think that? And, realists probably would have, like, theistic realists would probably have something to say. Unfortunately, I haven't seen enough of what they've had to say, so I don't know. But I'd be very curious to talk to them. And if you know any theistic naturalists that think like non-naturalist realism is more plausible if God exists than if God doesn't exist, put them in touch with me. I'd be happy to talk to them. And yeah, speaking of that, thinking Christian, I'm happy to talk to you again about all of this as well. Okay, so let's get back to where we were. We were at like what, 21? Okay. Let's see if we could finish this video.
About behavior itself. It's about the rationalities of beliefs and the subsequent rationality of actions under a given set of beliefs, not about just the actions themselves. Fourth is kind of a question. So am I saying that atheists can't know right from wrong? No, I think Christian theism says that everyone has some idea of what is right or wrong, even non-Christians and non-Jews. The question comes down to whether atheism can square this belief with atheism itself. Is atheism consistent with a belief in objective morality? And for the reasons I've given, I'm going to say no, you can't get a rational justification of good if you start out with not God. Perhaps another way to say this is, look, obviously, or hopefully, the atheist has some reason for their disbelief in God. Now, in pretty much all cases, especially in the Western world, this also leads to a disbelief in goodness, perhaps because goodness has traditionally been conceptualized as coming from God or God's nature. And once again, I would say
has it been?
Check out the results of,
like, has goodness traditionally been thought of as coming from God's nature?
Naturalists or atheists like Richard Joyce for a really compelling, I'd argue a compelling explanation of why goodness is just kind of not the kind of thing we can account for and perhaps should be really, really skeptical of. The next question you sometimes hear is, well, what about human rights or something?
Yeah, so just to address, because I think we're wrapping up the end of this video. In fact, let's finish the video and then I'll
sort of harm-based morality. Isn't my experience of harm somehow give me some experience that gives me knowledge that harm is something that ought to be avoided? And I would say each of these things are trying to get an ought from an is. Perhaps I'll make a separate video on each of them and why I think they fail. But I think the main problem with harm-based morality is I think you could buy the argument that me experiencing pain is me experiencing something that I don't want to happen. But at the same time, that's not enough of a robust reason for me to care about somebody else's experience with pain that I don't firsthand experience myself. So this doesn't quite get you to the robust type of moral realism that people want to have, where people have some sort of obligation or duty to their fellow being. So I would say this doesn't really quite get off the ground, although I kind of understand the appeal here. And then the last question is, well, perhaps science will eventually tell, like Michael Shermer. And I can kind of see their point. I mean, it's kind of like saying, look at all the...
Yeah, so like why engage with Michael Shermer, which there's nothing wrong with engaging everybody in this topic, but one would hope, so like, fine, engage with Michael Shermer, but I would be curious how Thinking Christian would engage with non-naturalist realists like David Enoch, who I spoke to, or Mike Humer, which again, I said I was going to finish the video. So let me.
Wonderful things science has achieved.
So this is relevant.
Why shouldn't we hold out for an eventual science of morality? Now, my response to this would be to say, well, people have tried to define morality with science over the past several centuries and have failed each time. And basically all they've done is basically ended up debunking our moral values. Remember, some of the previous books like Richard Joyce. For an interesting look at this, I'd say, look at Hunter Nihilisky's book, Science and the Good: The Tragic Quest for the Foundations of Morality. Basically, by the same inductive principle that would lead one to think that science could, in principle, answer this question, the continued failures, despite what I would say are valiant efforts from people like Bentham and Kant, should perhaps cause people to stop trying to look for an answer for science, just as many people have given up trying to make, a time machine or a perpetual motion machine or these other types of things. And regardless, this is just a huge argument from ignorance. But notice how arguing against it is not. The is-ought gap tells us we have good reasons to suggest that value propositions under science are not of the same kind, which basically points out that what people are pursuing under this scientific paradigm is something that accounts to a category mistake. Suppose, for instance, that every single electron, if you zoomed in enough, had, slavery is wrong spelled out in every single language. I still don't think this would be enough to tell us we ought not to have slaves. That's just still an is statement. There needs to be more to get to this robust type of moral realism to really say slavery is wrong and we have sort of knowledge of this. And think about it, right? What kind of scientific experiment would allow us to just discover something like a value proposition? That would be like saying, well, what kind of scientific experiment could we do to just discover the number 2 in the natural world? Hopefully you would see why this is kind of absurd. The number 2 is an abstract object that can't be found in the natural world. So trying to use science to, find it is kind of like looking for water in the desert. And this is why, at least personally, I'm not holding my breath for science to provide such an answer to these types of questions. So anyway, thanks for watching. I'll put up a couple references here. If you have any other questions, let me know.
Okay, so here's the issue. Here's the main issue with the video. I haven't seen any compelling demonstration that atheists are stuck with naturalistic accounts of morality. Why couldn't they just appeal to non-naturalist accounts? Now, I don't think they can, but that's because I don't think anybody can. I don't think anything about atheism in particular entails nihilism. If nihilism is true, and in this case, like it just seems to mean anti-realism, it's like here's why I would say that anti-realist accounts are true. I would say that they're true because all forms of moral realism are trivial, false, or unintelligible. That's going to hold whether God exists or not. God's just not like what we haven't seen is a good reason why like God solves any problems that atheists or secular proponents of moral realism would be stuck with. So if the position here was something like naturalist accounts of moral realism are unsatisfactory, fine. But all we really saw in the video for why those accounts are unsatisfactory was Moore's open question argument, which I don't think is definitive against naturalist accounts. In fact, it's only really good against like analytic naturalist accounts. So if the video is something like analytic naturalist accounts are not plausible, that would be fine. But atheists don't have to be naturalists. They don't have to be stuck with naturalist accounts of morality. They can appeal to non-naturalist accounts of morality, and they can appeal to naturalist accounts of morality that may be responsive to the problems raised in the video for the naturalist accounts. And so atheists have a lot of conceptual tools available at their disposal for responding to the claims made in the video. What I certainly think has not been shown is that atheism entails that anti-realism is true. I don't think there's anything, I mean, especially if we're taking that in the sort of natural language, use of that notion that if you're an atheist, you can't have realism, but that pragmatically implies that if you're not an atheist, if you're a theist, you could have realism. And I don't think that follows at all. And I don't think that the video has done enough to show that that's the case. I think we saw some arguments that could be a little, they could be formalized or they could be smoothed out linguistically to get around. They were, a bit hard to track because the language wasn't consistent across premises. And so that made those a bit hard to follow, but they all just seemed like sort of rehashes of a couple basic points, which is like an appeal to Moore's open question. And what looked to me like a presumption that basically the atheists are stuck with some type of empiricism or naturalism, depending on how broadly we want to construe everything is capable of being described by science. And a lot of this is sort of brushing over all of the responses that atheists actually do give when they favor moral realist accounts. Now, I'm no defender of moral realist accounts, but I am going to defend that there's nothing about atheism that's logically inconsistent with non-naturalist realism or naturalist realism. And so I just don't think it's been shown that atheism entails anti-realism. I don't think that's true. Not in the sense that I think it is meant when that's understood in a colloquial or sort of a non-formal sense. If we're taking it strictly to mean like if anti-realism is going to be false no matter what, if realism is going to be false no matter what, then sure, atheism entails anti-realism, but that'd be trivial. Like then if Mario 64 ever came out, then anti-realism is true. If this sky is blue, then anti-realism is true, but that'd be trivial. And so if the point here is to show that there's something distinctive about atheism, that you're stuck with anti-realism, but if you're a theist or not, that hasn't been shown. All right. I think I got to wrap it up there for the most part. Chris Taylor says, is a companions and guilt type argument going on. Atheism entails nihilism. Nihilism is bad, so atheism is bad. I didn't see one there. Maybe that's implied. I think the claim just here is that atheism entails anti-realism effectively. But that's not, you could just say, okay, then I'm an anti-realist. I do that. I didn't see, and therefore atheism is false. That didn't seem to be there. So that might be, it'd be like if someone said atheism entails you eat babies or something like that. People are probably not going to want to accept that. So then they would raise issues. But, it's going to be an issue of like reflective equilibrium or what implications or people are willing to accept. So no, I didn't see that there. Okay. Any other comments, remarks? I feel like I was a bit off today. A little foggy. I'm getting over a cold that fortunately was only a day or two, but you gotta keep the stream moving. I didn't feel like there was a lot that was said. It's been 2 hours and I feel like I didn't say anything. Again, I want to stream again to try to rectify today. Maybe I was just answering a lot of questions today and that took me a while. I don't know. I'm not seeing a whole lot more in the way of questions. So I guess I'll wrap it up there. Thanks, everybody. Got a few things in the works that I'm planning, conversations, discussions. I think I'm going on some kind of panel soon. Trying to get more comfortable talking about stuff other than meta-ethics. So I'm making an active effort. So I got more people to talk about AI. I'm going to be talking more about consciousness. Going to be talking about religion and the problem of evil. What else do we have? Getting into some people's sort of a life and how it influenced their philosophical views for some of the people I'm going to have on. Going to have some people on to talk about their research in experimental philosophy. So I've got a whole lot of stuff in the works. What is that? That's like 5 things already. So, and I got more on the way. The next, because I'm really into issues of psychological measurement, is inviting a couple of people on to talk about that as well. Okay, so that's about it. I'm not feeling great about today. And also, I'm just insanely thirsty. I even had a backup cup. See, 2 cups. I'm not feeling my best, so I apologize. But thanks, everybody. Still do please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel. In my description of the video, I've got all the stuff I'm on. Ugh, okay, yeah, I gotta get out of here. But thinking Christian, I hope I wasn't too. I think I was like more animated. You see how watch the last video and then compare it to this one, and it's such a world of difference when I have energy and I don't feel sick. Not that I feel super terrible, but thinking Christian, I'd love to have you on to talk about this stuff. So I hope we can do that and just have a chat about meta ethics. I guess the second time we could do round 2. And yeah, I don't know. So I think it'd be great. So get in touch if you want to. And for everybody else, I will see y'all later. Take care.